I never thought my life would unravel inside a bank, of all places. Banks had always been places of routine for me, sterile halls of transactions, and clipped voices echoing off glass walls. I grew up sitting cross-legged on vinyl chairs while my dad counted stacks of 20s, learning early on the difference between cash flow and a cash problem. For years I believed that stability was something you could measure in numbers, that love and trust were as unshakable as a signed contract. But numbers lie. People lie worse. And sometimes, the person you trust the most becomes the one who sharpens the knife against your back. On that morning, everything seemed normal. The air outside carried the sharp bite of autumn, the kind of cold that stings your nose but makes the coffee in your hands taste richer. I had dressed in my usual work clothes, black slacks and a pale blouse, hair twisted into a bun because I didn't feel like giving anyone the satisfaction of staring at me on the subway. I was 28, old enough to have learned how the world chipped away at women who smiled too easily. I lived alone in a small apartment above a laundromat, where the hum of dryers was my lullaby at night. My father had called me the night before, his voice tight with something I couldn't place. He wasn't a man of sentiment, but he always had a way of framing his demands as necessities. "Come to the bank with me tomorrow," he'd said, not asked. "It's important." And like I always did, I agreed, because despite all the times he had disappointed me, I still clung to the memory of him as the man who taught me how to ride a bike, who picked me up bleeding when I scraped my knees and told me to be tougher than the world. I walked into that bank the next day thinking maybe he needed a cosigner on a loan, or maybe he was finally ready to add my name to something that mattered. I wanted so badly for it to mean trust. Instead, what I walked into was betrayal disguised in paperwork. My father was already there, sitting with his back rigid in a chair across from a polished desk. The branch manager, a man with silver at his temples and a practiced smile, was shuffling papers in front of him. My father glanced up as I approached, his eyes sharp, commanding. "Sit," he said, not even bothering with a hello. I did, swallowing the irritation that bubbled in my chest. The manager pushed a thick packet of documents toward me. "These are just some forms to transfer certain holdings," he said smoothly, as if it were the most ordinary thing in the world. "Your father wanted you to review and sign them today." I picked up the first page, scanning it, and my stomach turned cold. This wasn't some minor adjustment. This was everything: our family's remaining assets, my mother's inheritance, the lake house she loved before she died, the last tether I had to her memory. All of it was being signed over, not to me, but to a faceless corporation my father had aligned himself with. My hand trembled slightly as I looked at him. "Dad, what is this?" "Just sign," he snapped, not meeting my eyes. "It's for the best. Don't make a scene." The words cut deeper than I expected. Don't make a scene. As if my resistance was an inconvenience, a childish outburst he had no patience for. My throat tightened. I thought of my mother, of how she used to whisper to me that I was her legacy, not just the money she left behind but the fire she knew I carried. She had begged my father not to squander what she worked for, and here he was, throwing it away without a second thought. I felt cornered, my mind racing. I knew if I refused outright, he'd find a way to punish me. He always did. But if I signed, I was complicit in my own erasure. My voice shook as I asked, "Why are you doing this?" He finally looked at me then, and the chill in his eyes told me everything. "Because I can. Because you owe me. Every damn thing you have is because of me. So you'll do what I say." That was the moment I realized love had nothing to do with this. He didn't see me as his daughter. I was just another tool, another signature to secure his deals. My chest ached, but beneath the ache was rage, molten and consuming. I knew I couldn't win by fighting him outright. He'd drag me down, crush me under his heel. But I wasn't stupid. If I wanted to survive this, I needed to play along. So I smiled, shaky but convincing. "Of course, Dad." I picked up the pen. My heart hammered so loud I thought they'd hear it echoing off the marble walls. But before I touched ink to paper, I glanced at the manager, holding his gaze just a second too long. And then, with the pen tip hidden behind my hand, I scrawled a tiny note at the bottom corner of the page, "Help me. He's forcing me." It was a gamble, the kind of desperate move only someone drowning would make. The manager's eyes flickered, barely, but I saw it. He had read it. He knew. For the rest of the meeting, I signed where I was told, my hands steady even as my insides twisted. I smiled when my father praised me for being smart. I laughed when he said we'd celebrate later. But the entire time, I was watching that manager, waiting for a signal, praying he wouldn't look away. When it was over, my father left the office first, smug and satisfied. I lingered, tucking my bag over my shoulder. The manager leaned forward just slightly, sliding a business card across the desk. "If you ever need to review any of these documents again, you call me directly," he said, his voice careful. I took the card, meeting his eyes. He knew. He believed me. It wasn't salvation, not yet, but it was the first lifeline I'd had in years. Walking out of that bank, I felt hollow. My father's hand landed heavy on my shoulder as we stepped into the crisp air, and all I wanted to do was shrug it off. "Good girl," he said, pride dripping from his voice like poison. I smiled back because it was safer, but inside, something in me snapped. That night, I couldn't sleep. I sat in my apartment staring at the ceiling, replaying every moment, every word. I thought of all the times he'd controlled me, manipulated me, used guilt as a chain around my neck. I thought of how he'd turned my mother's love into leverage, how he'd twisted me into believing obedience was survival. But the bank changed everything. He didn't just want control, he wanted to erase me. And I couldn't let that happen. That was the night I decided I wasn't his daughter anymore. I was his enemy. The weeks that followed the signing felt like walking across glass barefoot, every step sharp and bloody, but I forced myself to keep moving. My father grew bolder after that day at the bank, as if my signature had confirmed what he'd always believed, that I was his to command, to silence, to discard when convenient. He called me constantly, demanding errands, berating me when I asked questions, reminding me in his clipped tone that I owed him everything. At first, I tried to pretend it was just more of the same, the cycle I had endured for years. But something had shifted. It wasn't just control anymore. It was annihilation. He wanted to strip me of every tie to my mother, every ounce of independence I had carved out for myself. I started noticing withdrawals from accounts I once thought were safe, accounts my mother had left in my name. One by one, they dwindled. He'd always been manipulative, but now he was reckless, like a gambler who knew he was close to losing everything and decided to drag me down with him. The bank manager, Mr. Hale, he'd introduced himself with that quiet professionalism that hides sharp instincts, called me 2 weeks later. He didn't say much, just that he wanted me to stop by and review some documents, exactly like he'd hinted that day. My hands shook as I held the phone, but his voice steadied me. It was the first time someone acknowledged, without saying it outright, that they saw me. When I went back, he had copies of everything I'd signed. "I shouldn't be showing you these," he whispered, lowering his voice so his assistant wouldn't overhear. "But I want you to understand what's at stake." He laid the papers out, neat as surgery tools. The signatures were mine, but my note was still faintly visible on the corner of the first page, like a ghost of my desperation. "Your father transferred everything into a trust controlled by him," Mr. Hale said. "You don't technically own anything anymore. But that doesn't mean you're powerless." Those words lit something in me. Powerless. I had been living under that label my whole life, but hearing him say I wasn't, hearing it from a man who had seen hundreds of families tear each other apart over money, was like oxygen. Still, the damage kept spreading. My father started bringing me around his new business partners, men with shark smiles who looked at me like I was just another asset on a balance sheet. At one dinner, one of them clinked his glass against mine and said, "Your father tells us you're very cooperative." Good girl. I wanted to smash the glass into his face, watch the red wine bleed into the white tablecloth, but I didn't. Instead, I smiled. Because I had learned the most dangerous weapon in my arsenal wasn't violence. It was patience. At home, I broke. Nights were the worst. I'd lie awake staring at the shadows on my ceiling, remembering my mother's laugh, the way she'd braid my hair when I was little and whisper that I was strong. I'd press my face into her old scarf and cry until the fabric was damp with grief and fury. Some mornings, I didn't want to get up at all. But each time I thought of giving in, I remembered my father's smirk at the bank, the way he said, "Because I can." That phrase became a blade in my chest, and I swore to myself that one day, I'd turn it back on him. The first step was learning. I began shadowing every move he made, listening more than I spoke. I paid attention at dinners, eavesdropped on calls when he wasn't careful. I discovered he was deeper in debt than he let on. The corporation he funneled everything into wasn't a fortress, it was a shell, one crack away from collapsing. He thought transferring assets to it made him untouchable, but all it really did was make him vulnerable to someone who knew where to press. I started keeping a notebook, small enough to tuck into my purse. At work, I jotted down dates, overheard names, numbers I memorized before scribbling. I wrote it all in code, fragments only I could piece together. Each page was a piece of his empire, stripped of polish and reduced to weaknesses. At first, it was just survival, proof to myself that I wasn't as helpless as he thought. But the more I wrote, the more I realized what I was building. It wasn't just a notebook. It was a weapon, but revenge doesn't grow in isolation. There was also love, or at least what I thought was love, until it crumbled in my hands like ash. His name was Ryan. We'd been together for nearly 3 years, and though he'd always been wary of my father, he was my anchor in the storm. I told him everything one night, the truth about the bank, the documents, the note. He listened, brow furrowed, jaw tight. I thought he was angry for me. I thought he was my ally, for a while he was. He held me when I cried, told me we'd find a way to fight back, promised me I wasn't alone. But promises are cheap when temptation whispers louder. My father had always been good at sniffing out weaknesses, and Ryan's weakness was ambition. He wanted more money, more status, more of everything I couldn't give him. And my father, the master manipulator, saw his opening. I found out the betrayal slowly. Missed calls. Late nights. Excuses that didn't line up. And then, one evening when I stopped by Ryan's apartment unannounced, I found him on the phone. His back was to me, but I knew the voice on the other end. My father's. My stomach dropped as I heard Ryan say, "Don't worry, sir. She won't see it coming." The world spun. My knees nearly buckled. He turned when he noticed me, face blanching, words stuttering out of him. But it was too late. I saw the truth in his eyes, and it gutted me. He wasn't my anchor. He was the final weight pulling me under. I didn't scream. I didn't cry. I walked out without a word, my body moving on autopilot. Outside, the air was damp, the city lights blurred through the film of tears I refused to let fall. That was the night I stopped believing in love. Love was a weakness, a currency too easily bought. From then on, I had no allies. Only enemies, the days after that were a blur of rage and clarity. My father wanted me erased. Ryan wanted me silenced. They thought I was a pawn on their board, too naive to play the game. But they forgot something vital. Pawns that survive long enough can reach the other side of the board. And when they do, they become queens. I began planning in earnest. Real planning, not just scribbles in a notebook. I mapped out his finances, tracked the shell corporations, even followed Ryan once, staying far enough back that he never knew. He met with my father in a downtown cafe, shaking hands like they were partners. The sight of it burned into me. But I didn't lash out. I took notes. I memorized details. Every smile, every handshake, every slip of information became fuel. One night, I stood in front of the mirror, looking at myself as if seeing a stranger. My eyes were harder now, my face sharper. I whispered aloud, "You wanted to erase me. Now I'll erase you." The words felt foreign, terrifying, but also liberating. For the first time, I wasn't the daughter. I wasn't the betrayed girlfriend. I was the architect of something darker, something inevitable, and so, my revenge began to take shape. I followed the lines I had drawn with surgical patience, letting each small victory sharpen the blade I was fashioning. There were nights when I almost faltered, when the memory of Ryan's face, pleading, rationalizing, the way he'd tried to say it wasn't about me, threatened to pull me back into the woman I used to be, soft, gullible, aching for a safe harbor. But I refused to drown again in someone else's lies. I had learned to keep my emotions on a leash, to look at people for what they were and not for what I wished them to be. My plan unfolded in layers, like a con man's deck of tricks. The first layer was to make sure I had leverage, something that would make my father and his partners hesitate to move without checking their steps. For weeks I dug through legal filings, corporate registries, anything that could be used as leverage or exposed as a risk. It was tedious work, the kind that bent the edges of your brain and taught you to find patterns in bureaucracy. I learned to love the monotony. There is a peculiar kind of peace in following a trail of paper to its rotten core. I discovered that my father's shell company, the one he used to funnel assets away from the legal reach of our name, had several weak points. There were loans backed by the lake house's title, liens filed improperly, and a trustee with an address that led to a mailbox service 2 blocks from a strip mall. These were tiny mistakes, nothing to bring down a person by itself, but collectively they formed a lattice of vulnerability. It was as if, in his rush to protect himself, he had accidentally exposed his skeleton. I started making calls. I posed as an interested investor, a disgruntled former employee, a distant relative, whatever role would get someone to cough up details. Some doors closed. Others opened. People slip when you press them at the right angle. A nervous assistant in a law firm mentioned that the trust's paperwork had been rushed, signed late at night, likely without the usual oversight. An ex-accountant hinted there were off-books transactions that would look ugly under scrutiny. Each fragment became a card in my growing house of consequences. The second layer of my plan was more personal. I had to make sure my father would feel the sting in the place that mattered to him, reputation. He had always worn respectability like armor. He believed that social standing could smooth over any moral ugliness. So I began to thread gossip into the veins of his social sphere. Not outright lies, my father was a careful man and would smell that immediately, but insinuations, quiet questions that spread like a stain. Who was that new partner he brought to the club? Strange loans, did you hear? The right ears in the right country club, the right whispers at the right charity gala, and suddenly his name was no longer safe. I also needed to isolate him from allies. The men he relied on were used to his domineering presence and the illusions he could manufacture. But men are notoriously selfish, push them by revealing the cost of association, and they will step away. I don't mean I became a puppet master pulling strings at cocktail parties. I had no network, no social currency. I had only intelligence, and intelligence can masquerade as anything if you wield it well. I fed a few careful hints to business journalists, those hungry vultures who live for scandal. An anonymous tip here, a document slipped there, and the first article appeared, framed as unverified concerns about the financial dealings around certain trusts. The headline was small, a whisper rather than a shout, but it sank its teeth into the social fabric around my father. Meanwhile, I tightened the screws on Ryan. He was a necessary obstacle, a crumb of leverage, but also a bitter reminder of how my father had wormed his way into every crevice of my life. I confronted him once, face to face, in the dim light of a diner at 3 a.m. He had that guilty, practiced look people get when they're used to being forgiven. I let him speak for a moment, let his explanations roll off me. Then I told him something I had kept secret up until then. I had evidence of his meetings with my father, timestamps, photos, a trail of messages he believed he'd deleted. I didn't need to destroy him, I only needed him to be useful. He agreed, eager, ashamed, ready to redeem himself, because redemption for him meant profit. It was a deal of mutual self-preservation. He'd made a choice once, now he could make one again. Part of me hated him in a way that felt primal. I would have loved to see him suffer. But hatred is an expensive currency, it burns you as it illuminates. I put the flame to use instead, forging the instrument of my revenge from it. I let Ryan squirm, then I let him be my inside man. He met people he used to meet with my father, wore the ease of their conversations like a costume, and fed me the architecture of their agreements, and then there was the bank, Mr. Hale. He was the quiet hand that steadied me, a man whose silence could carry the weight of a verdict. He had read my note at the meeting and chosen to act with the caution of someone who had seen families devour themselves over money. He offered me a way to weaponize what I'd collected. "You can expose him," he said one evening in his office, voice low, "but exposure without a plan ruins people for no gain. If you want him gone, you need a legal and social trap that closes at the same time." I didn't know whether justice or vengeance drove me, only that their net had to be inescapable. So I synchronized the pieces. I arranged for the journalist's next, larger piece to hit the presses at the same hour a forensic audit would begin, the audit triggered by a call I made using a lawyer's anonymity service. Lawyers take calls from interested parties all the time. A week before, I discovered discrepancies to a state regulatory official, an anonymous tip with the right documents attached, and they opened an inquiry. The regulators were slow, bureaucratic, predictable, and that was my ally. Predictability lets you time the strike. Then I added a complication my father didn't see coming: emotion. Yes, I was constructing a professional takedown, but humans make mistakes when their hearts get involved, and my father had always worn his heart like a secret pride. I knew the one place where he let his guard fall was with the lake house, the place he'd turned into a shrine for memories he'd never fully deserved. People go soft in places where they once loved. I spent a night outside the property, under the cold stars, studying the house's patterns, when the caretaker came, the neighbor who walked his dog at the edge of the property, the little habits that make up a life. I found the caretaker was lax with paperwork, that the house's mortgage had some irregular amortization schedules attached. Those little glitches could compound into legal knots when properly pulled. I will not lie and say I had no doubts. There were mornings when I stared at the pages in my hand and wondered if I was as monstrous as my father. Revenge has a way of changing you. The thirst grows teeth, and you begin to plan around those teeth, to love the sensation of the hunt. But I kept reminding myself of the smaller things: my mother's laugh, the scarf she wore when she tucked me in, the way she told me to stand up straight and never let anyone tell me I belonged to them. Was this justice, or was this the final surrender to darkness? Sometimes the line blurred. But then I would see my father in my mind, in that bank office, his eyes cold, and the answer would harden again like winter. The execution began on a gray November morning. I was awake before dawn, hands numb from the coffee I drank to steady myself. The journalist had agreed to run the story, an exposé on corrupt trusts and questionable transfers, focusing on a nameless, prominent local businessman, whose practices merited investigation. The article ran with enough detail to make people curious, but not enough to make the lawyers twitch. It was a prologue. By noon, the regulators sent a polite but firm letter to my father's firm requesting documents. He laughed when he heard about it, on the video call where Ryan recorded his reaction so I could use it as evidence later, and he mocked the overzealous reporter. That was his first mistake. He underestimated the hunger of institutions once they sense blood. The second move I made was quieter. I filed, under my mother's name, a formal challenge to one of the trust transfers. Technically, it should have been dismissed on a technicality. My mother had passed and the transfer was already in place, but the paperwork I'd dug up showed an irregular notarization. A notary had signed with a stamp that didn't match records. When the trust company saw that, they panicked. They were not above burying mistakes, but they were terrified of legal exposure that could ripple through their partners. That evening, when I confronted my father with a thinly veiled smile and the appearance of concern, he brushed it off. He was arrogant then, smug, certain that power sheltered him. He invited me to dinner at his favorite restaurant, the one with the soft lights, and the maitre d', who always called him Mr. Conway, like an offering. I went because I wanted to see his face when the world tilted. I wanted him to know the hand that would strike him had a human wrist beneath it. At the table, he sipped his wine and told me about a new investment, how soon the corporation would consolidate everything. I listened in feigned admiration, tasting the bile rising in my throat. 2 days later, the trustee's phone rang incessantly. By the time my father answered, his voice had that brittle edge. The trustee, who had been a partner in my father's scheme, wanted answers. The regulator's inquiry had turned into a pre-dawn subpoena after they found the notary's irregularity. The trustee demanded meetings, assurances, audits, and when he discovered the trustee's own handwriting on a document that suggested complicity, he started to doubt his loyalty. Loyalty in my father's world had always been transactional. Remove the transaction and you've removed the loyalty. That's when the social network began to fray. My father's longtime golfing partner, a man who loved his name in glowing brass at the club, dropped him from the board of a charity foundation to avoid conflict. Those are the exact words people use when they don't want to explain that their own names might suffer by association. The charity's press release was careful, clinical. But within our social bubble, the word association spreads faster than any scandal. A man's worth is only as much as the company he keeps. I expected my father to retaliate, to throttle his way back into dominance. For a while he did. He made furious phone calls. He sent men to my apartment, old associates who thought a warning was enough to scare me into submission. They knocked on my door, eyes hard, but when I opened the door, I made sure a neighbor was watching and that my phone recorded everything. They left with stale threats and a disk of proof I tucked into a safe deposit box with Mr. Hale. Legal avenues require documentation. The men who believed in fear over evidence discovered a new problem. I had records. The true turning point came at the lake house. He had sent a lawyer to secure certain documents, and the lawyer had made a sloppy error, an email chain that sent the wrong file to the wrong person. The file contained an off-the-record memo, an admission that certain assets had been intentionally underlabeled to avoid taxation. The trustee, the one who still had some sense of self-preservation, suddenly wanted out. He was my ticket. I offered him a deal: cooperate with the regulators, testify to the inconsistencies, and I would ensure he wasn't destroyed in the process. Self-preservation can be a tender thing. People jump if the ground below them starts shaking. When the trustee flipped, the floodgates opened. The regulators widened their net. They interviewed accountants, subpoenaed bank records, and hinted at criminal negligence investigations. My father called me, the anger raw in his voice, telling me how I had betrayed him, how families should not act like this. He didn't understand that families are sometimes about ownership, not love. I told him, calmly, that I had only wanted what was rightfully mine. He laughed and told me the right words: "You always were dramatic." I told him that drama was a luxury for people who never had to fight to survive. He said nothing after that. In the days that followed, his empire began to crumble in pieces. The press picked up on the regulator's actions, a few outlets connected the dots to his social sphere. His partners, smelling ruin, distanced themselves like animals fleeing a burning barn. Ryan, when I called him, sounded hollow. He had wanted to be saved, and in a way he had been saved from his own conscience by complicity in the past. He had helped me enough to get his name off the list of people who could be tied directly to criminal charges. He had given me what I needed and in return, bought himself something that looked like redemption, and yet, none of it scratched the part of me that wanted to see my father crumble publicly. I wanted him to understand the particular humiliation of losing respect. The men who had once told me to sign because I said so now had men who would not return his calls. The grand parties thinned, the invitations dried up. He began to show at functions, a little late, a little uncertain, trying to salvage the remains of a reputation he had spent decades polishing with illusions. The climactic scene was not cinematic in the way films like to portray: no gunfire, no rooftop chases. It was bureaucratic and cold, the kind of thing people in suits think is civilized. The regulators convened in a conference room that smelled like lemon cleaner. There were stacks of documents, a quiet hum of a copier, the clink of coffee cups. My father sat at a long table, his hands folded, his jaw clenched. The trustee testified, the auditors presented spreadsheets, the lawyers argued technicalities. It was all so mundane, and yet it was a massacre. He was charged with misappropriation, with fraudulent transfers, with the manipulation of trusts. The state wanted to make an example of him to scare other men into obeying the law. The story splashed across newspapers and sat on the feeds of every smartphone in town. People who had once leaned into my father's shadow now leaned away. I watched from the safety of a borrowed apartment, hands wrapped around a mug that had gone cold, and felt something I hadn't expected. It wasn't pure triumph. There was a hollowness there, an echo where the shapes of my old hopes had been. He went to court with the same arrogance he used to put on like a tailored suit. But in the end, even a tailored suit won't hold when everything beneath it is falling apart. Of course, he fought. He hired the best lawyers money could buy, until the money itself was in question. He threatened to sue me, to ruin anyone who crossed him. He accused me of being ungrateful, of fabricating stories to gain sympathy. He tried to turn the narrative to his favor by painting himself as the victim of an angry daughter with a grudge. But his friends had turned away, his partners had cut the cords, and the evidence was relentless. The law is not poetic, it is procedural. And when you build your life on procedures meant to hide misdeeds, there is a satisfaction in seeing those procedures used to bring you down.